which now leads us to parable number 3, which if you look at just the sheer verses and the column space from Luke's perspective here, you get 7 verses for the first parable, and then you get 8, 9, 10, 3 verses for the second parable, and then we get 11 through 32 for the third parable. Totally dominates by 2 times more than the other 2 parables combined. It might tell us that there's more involved when we're talking about sons here. 2 sons, 1 father, and the story's about to unfold here. So there's a lot happening here. Let's set the stage in verse 11. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons. Now, we have to push pause. We have to take a time out here and say, what is Jesus doing? He's already told 2 stories to these Pharisees and scribes back in verse 1 and 2, who are kind of inwardly mocking him for spending time with publicans and sinners. He's already proved a point, but he's going to tell it a third way from a different angle that is really powerful. And so he really cuts to the heart here. A certain man had 2 sons. This is going to hit a little closer to home. It's easier for them to feel more removed from a shepherd with 100 sheep, because none of these Pharisees are going to be shepherds. That's a lowly servant. And none of these Pharisees or scribes is going to really directly relate to a woman who loses 1 piece of silver out of 10. Most of them are probably fairly rich, and they're like, it's not a big deal. But now when you start talking about a father with 2 sons, most of them will probably be able to directly relate to this story in a more personal way.
Either as fathers or as sons. And Jesus goes on and says, and the younger of the 2 sons said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that follow to me. And the father divided unto the 2 sons his living.
So basically, this boy, the younger son, went up to dad and in a first century Jewish context said to his dad, Dad, you're dead to me. I'd rather have you dead because I just want my inheritance. You don't usually get inheritance until your parents have passed on. And then that inheritance is divided up. But this kid is saying, I want it now. This is significant because his dad's fairly rich, we find out in this story. And so he divided up his inheritance. The dad actually did it. He gave this young son we would assume, roughly 1/3 of everything that he owns. And some are like, wait, he has 2 kids, so he should have given half. Keep in mind, under a law of Moses context, the older son gets a double portion, and then remaining sons get a single portion. So if there are only 2 sons, that means you divide it into 3, the older son gets a double portion. So this is a son who only gets 1/3, but that's a lot from his dad. And what does he do? Verse 13 says, not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, which, to the Pharisees and scribes listening, would have implied, they would have heard, oh, he went into Gentile lands. Because the Jewish lands, the house of Israel among your family and kindred lands where it's safe, clean, ritually pure kinds of places, none of them are far countries. So if this kid went to a far country, that means he's now among the Gentiles. And there he wasted his substance with riotous living. So did you catch this? He's taking that which he had not earned, hadn't worked for. He was born into this, and he took it prematurely, went into this far country, and he wasted it with riotous living among the Gentiles. And I have to be honest again, when I was back in seminary with this parable, it kind of drove me crazy because I thought, what is wrong with this dad? Why did he first give that money? And secondly, Why didn't he follow the kid into this far country and spy him out and go and rescue him when he had only spent the first few days worth of the wealth on riotous living, and come to him and say, "Oh, my son, I found you. Let's rejoice like the good shepherd. Go find your son and bring him home. Carry him if you need to. Bring him home." There's a problem. And the problem is, how did this boy get lost? Did he wander? Was he neglected? Or was there something else going on? Did he willingly and knowingly choose to rebel? He made a conscientious set of decisions that put him on this path to take him away from his father and squander this. It was a known rebellion. It wasn't wandering and it wasn't neglect. And if it's a known rebellion, what happens if dad shows up a few days into his riotous living? Is the kid going to say, "Oh, good, Dad, you found me. I'm so glad. Thank you for coming to save me"? I could be wrong, but I think the young lad would have been extremely angry and embarrassed and gotten up in a huff and gone into an even further country apart and tried to cover his tracks better so that his dad couldn't track him down, because he's making a free will choice here to do this. Right? Verse 14, when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want.
Understatement.
Brothers and sisters, verse 14 is the ultimate understatement in the law of the harvest context of you reap what you sow. You cannot plant seeds of wickedness and hope to produce and enjoy fruits of righteousness. And wickedness never, ever, ever was happiness. It always leads to a person feeling empty, in want, hollow. And that process might take days, it might take weeks, it might take months or years or decades, and it might even take a lifetime. But eventually, people in this category realize, oh, I'm in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, implication being, it's a Gentile. He's now going to go work for a Gentile, a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. Now, if you're one of the Pharisees and scribes standing there as Jesus is telling this story, you have probably a visual reaction. You're going to revolt at this part of the story. Ooh.
You're with Gentiles and with pigs, which are against the law of Moses, and you're feeding them? I mean, it cannot get worse than this. It's almost as if the son has become a swine himself.
Or could it get worse? Has he reached the bottom of the barrel yet? Look at verse 16. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. Oh my goodness. If you've never watched pigs eat slop out of a trough before, it's revolting. It's nauseating. And here's this lad, he's feeding the swine, and he's looking at the food they're eating, wishing he could eat it with them, but they won't let him eat it because it's for the pigs. It's not for him. That should tell us something about the condition of this lad. He's working basically as a servant for these people, probably not making very much money. They aren't even feeding him appropriately to the point where he's wanting to eat pig slop, which tells you he's probably not very healthy. Now, if you could make in your mind's eye, if you could just see a list of potential attributes of this boy right now, how would you describe him? What are some of the words you'd put on a list in your mind? What does he look like? What does he smell like? What would he feel like? This kid is not in a good place. And now watch what happens. Verse 17, and when he came to himself. Did you catch that? Taylor introduced this earlier. You can't go and pull a rebel out and say, you will come back home because I found you. They have to work through some processes on their own, it seems. He came to himself, and what is his conclusion? You can picture him out there in this pig trough. And he kind of wakes up. He comes to himself and says, wait a minute. I'm sitting here, and how many of my hired servants of my father have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? And now this beautiful turning point, verse 18. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. So that's his plan. He's like, I'm going to go home and I'm going to beg Dad, who I can no longer really call Dad because of what I've done. I'm going to beg him to be one of his hired servants instead. At least I'll have a roof over my head and bread to eat. And so now he begins this long journey home. Verse 20, and he arose and came to his father. You remember in your mind how you pictured what that young man looked like out with those pigs? He was probably pretty skinny, probably pretty emaciated, actually, not healthy, smelled terrible. And now he's come home on a very long journey with no means, no wealth to pay for nice lodging and nice ointments for his body and nice food for his belly and nice drink. By the time he gets home from a long journey, whatever you pictured him like in the pig's sty, he's going to be way worse by the time he gets back home. And then this next part is amazing. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. You have some options here. Jesus doesn't tell you. It's a parable. It's a story to teach a principle. One of the options is Dad came out of his house that morning and was walking out to the barn, and he glances down the long lane out to the main road, and he sees a character coming from a long way off, and he says, who? That kid looks like he's walking like my son. It is my son. And he just happened to see him right at that moment. That's an option. But I think a far more likely scenario is that Dad has been doing what a father of a rebellious son can do, which is to pray and to hold on to hope and to faith that someday my boy's going to come home. I love him, and someday he's going to return to me, which means the father is probably looking down that road, watching that road, that empty road for days, weeks, months, maybe years or decades, waiting for the first sign that his boy has decided to come home, at which point the dad runs down the lane towards the boy. Can you picture that little moment? Can you picture that son seeing Dad running towards him, and he's got his speech all prepared? Dad, I've totally messed up. I'm not worthy to be called your son anymore. I just want to be one of your servants. But he doesn't get a chance to deliver his long prepared speech because Dad comes up and he grabs that boy. Now, I don't know about you, but our human tendency might be to come a little closer and see him and think, you're looking rough, very unkempt, very dirty, and you don't smell very good, and you don't look very healthy. I'm not sure if you have diseases. Let's go home and get you cleaned up, and then I'm going to give you a hug. I love the father in this parable because he doesn't seem to smell the stench. He doesn't seem to be focusing on the dirt and the grime and the pig slop. He's not looking at the emaciated state of this boy who has made so many poor decisions. He's looking beneath all of that. And underneath all of that soil and that stain, he sees his son. And he loves that boy. And he grabs that boy and pulls him into an embrace. And he doesn't just hug him, he kisses him.
With all that slime and smelliness, he's not even worried. The father is not even worried. Not worried about germs, not worried about being infected. His son's home. He's willing to give that kiss of welcome.
Now, at that point, the boy is feeling a little overwhelmed. And now he gives his speech. The son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and I'm no more worthy to be called thy son. And I love the fact that Dad at this point doesn't say, oh, really? You mean you don't have all that money I gave you and it's gone and you squandered? You lived a riotous lifestyle? Well then, okay, yeah, you're no longer my son. Dad doesn't do that. He calls for his other servants, come and bring forth the best robe and put it on him. Anytime in the New Testament when you're being clothed or things are being put on somebody, there's an allusion to that Greek word enduo, to endow, to put on a robe or a garment, a sacred clothing, a covering. There's something beautiful about this, that in exchange for all this terrible stuff, he's not turned into a servant. He's treated with a royal homecoming, with a robe and a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. He's being clothed and dressed as if he were royalty, as if he were a prince.
And then bring hither the fatted calf and kill it and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. You would only throw a feast of that size if you have somebody of considerable honor in your presence. I mean, the best calf. Otherwise, you might just get him some bread. So this shows the enormous love, the enduring love that the Father had for the Son. And those listening to the story should be able to understand that God the Father has this kind of enduring love for us. And yet there's a plot twist in here.
In all of Luke 15, there's one person who's upset, angry at the return or the finding of that which is lost. And it starts in verse 25. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him. And then you get this interesting discussion where the father is trying to help this older son understand. But first, the older son says, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. Pause. Take a time out. Which of the two sons am I? Which of the two sons are you? You see how easy it is to read this parable from a safe distance and talk about the young son as if he's the other? It's not me, because I've not committed any of these serious kinds of sins. I've never had to come home saying, I'm not worthy anymore to even be called your son. Can I just be your servant? Can I at least be included with the servant quarters? Most people, when they read this parable, they love to associate with the older son, the group that says, hey, we're good. We've never committed serious sin. Since it's a parable, you're free to apply it in whatever way works for you. But I would remind us of Joseph Smith's key for unlocking meaning in the parables. Remember, he says the 100 sheep represent Sadducees and Pharisees. In this case, the one who says to the Lord, I've always done everything you've ever asked me to do. I've never transgressed at any time thy commandment. That doesn't sound possible. Doesn't sound like somebody who is anything more than just a self-righteous person saying, I've been perfect. I've never done this. And in that setting, with Jesus eating with publicans and sinners, with the Pharisees and scribes judging them, there's a very clear allusion to which group is which son. And look at this next part, verse 30. As soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And the father says, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. I don't know what that means exactly in this world back then with Jesus talking to these Pharisees and scribes. They are the recipients of this parable as the publicans and sinners get to overhear it. But using Joseph Smith's key, I think he might be saying to the Pharisees and scribes, you've always been with the law of Moses. You've always had access to these scriptures. Everything that I've had is yours, free for the taking. Look at verse 32. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost. And now can you picture him looking at the crowd around the table with him, and is found